It was a great idea, but it doesn't go far enough.
No, man, it went too far. But guys, all I'm saying is a year or 6 months of THC Plus makes a great gift. Believe me, I just signed Douglas Dietrich up for a year, and he couldn't be happier.
Okay, I love you dearly. Yes, honestly, you flatter me too much. If you were a member of the opposite sex, I would propose.
See, what'd I tell you? Merry Christmas, people.
In the 1930s, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt addressed the nation through a series of radio broadcasts known as the Fireside Chats. His aim was to reassure the common man that our society would recover from its troubled times. But we're far from 1930, and I deal with a different kind of fire. For a new era of worldly frustration, we offer a fresh conversation. I'm Greg Carlwood, and these are the Higherside Chats.
Here we go, Higherside Chatters, drinking a little drink, smoking a little smoke from San Diego. I'm Greg Carlwood on a brand new microphone in the newly upgraded Carlwood studio. Can you tell? Probably not. I think it sounds exactly the same. Compare it to the old mic in the actual interview, and then you'll know where a couple $100 went. But let's get on with it. So, folks, we've been doing this conspiracy thing for a while, and I think we've all heard vaguely about the alignments of ancient structures and monuments, or the Freemasonic patterns of Washington, D.C., and I'm sure we've all wondered, what is the deal here? What structures are actually aligned? How far does this study go? What might be learned from it? Why does it even get done in the first place? Is it based on some strange energetic properties? Some form of occult ritual, or just an interesting way to lay out a garden? It really is tough to say, and the man of the hour is Cort Lindahl. He's been dedicating a lot of research to this, more than anyone I know of, and it's great stuff. And much like David Paulides, who will recite case after case of strange, unexplained disappearances and leaves the speculating to the listener, Cort has mapped out so many alignments and connections between different monuments to show correlations we never even knew were there. And he can rattle off so many interesting threads in the realm of geomancy and Axis Mundi alignments, and he too kind of leaves the speculation to people like me. But his facts are fascinating, and the depth of these connections is deeper than I would have expected before I started seeing Cort's work, which was brought to me by a THC Plus listener. So thanks for that. I think it ended up being a great show. Obelisks, Axis Mundi, Thomas Jefferson, the Dome of the Rock, Constantine, the Georgia Guidestones, Mount Shasta, and even an interesting new side to the legend of Coral Castle. So let's do it. The mapping master of alignment and refinement himself, Cort Lindahl. All right, people, most of us have heard that ancient structures like the Great Pyramids of Giza were built with certain alignments in mind, and many of us have seen the patterns that are coded into areas of high Masonic influence like Washington, D.C. We've even been told that many of these sites and structures around the planet might have been set up in some type of grid for energetic or possibly even downright magical reasons that we won't be able to pin down until we can wrestle these secrets from the clutches of the occult orders, secret societies, and master masons who built them in the first place. But today we're going to get as good an understanding as we can because our guest Cort Lindahl has been examining these historic landmarks and all-important locations as well as how they correlate and connect to each other for several years now. He's been sharing his findings on these geomantic information structures in a series of YouTube videos on his channel, numerous articles on his blog, and his book entitled Axis Mundi. It's a fascinating piece of the big conspiracy puzzle, and I cannot wait to dive in. Cort, my man, welcome to THC.
Well, thanks for having me, Greg. I'm excited to be here and tell everybody about what I've been finding.
Yeah, man. And thanks so much for your time. I've really been enjoying going through your work. A lot of these alignments and connections that you found were pretty surprising to me. I think the people will agree. But it can get a little complex at times, and I think terms like Axis Mundi might be new for some people. So to kick this thing off, let me ask you, how do you normally introduce the uninitiated into some of these topics and this work that you're doing?
Well, what I would say first is that in antiquity, long before it was thought this was possible, there were priesthoods and groups of people, that comprised of intellectual or highly intelligent people who could figure all this out. We see, the Greeks having an extensive knowledge of geometry, and some suspect them even of creating the first latitude and longitude grid. So it's related, first of all, to men just observing the stars, for millennia, for thousands of years, and recording their positions relative to a given point where often a temple would be built. So really what they're doing, kind of that word and the prefix temp or temporal is kind of what they've concerned themselves with, because a byproduct of observing the stars is for you to be aware of the time on the globe, or the time till that next star alignment will happen. So what we see, in my opinion, is the establishment of certain places on the globe that were axis mundi, or axis of the world, which would be their center point for measurement. So places like the Great Pyramid, the ruins of Baalbek in Lebanon, and the Tower of the Winds in Athens, Greece, I believe were all built to be geodetic markers on the Earth. And so this infers that they were aware of the shape of the Earth enough to be able to plot positions in relation to these axis mundi, or center points. And what you see, like in ancient Rome and in Greece, there were priesthoods known as augurs that would actually do dedication ceremonies for the temple and decide which way the temple was oriented. And a lot of this does go back to Egypt at a time when priesthood called kneaders would actually realign the agricultural fields after each flood of the Nile. So they did have a reason, a practical reason to want to divide property. And as time went on, we'll see that rulers would use this system to define their domain. So they would have a temple that was an axis mundi that would define a corresponding templum, or sphere of influence that they had. So the geometric part of it, whether the axis is shaped like a hexagon, a square, or an octagon, these shapes infer directions on the globe. So often they would place talismanic corresponding structures around even divisions of the octagon, let's say. And so these buildings would actually point to other buildings, which were many times oriented to point to each other over long distances on the globe. And so really, I guess the best example I've come up with, well, all of it in the modern sense is based on the Tower of the Winds in Athens, Greece, which is a small octagonal tower that has a god assigned to each of the 16 directions that they considered important. And we later see the same phenomena occurring or being installed at St. Peter's Square of the Vatican. There, it's really obvious. Now, we know the obelisk was once only about 150 yards from where it is now that's in St. Peter's Square. So at this scale, none of these measurements would really change. But you see a distinct value of this beginning during the reign of Emperor Constantine, who was the first Byzantine ruler of the Eastern Empire and made his capital in Constantinople. So we see that he may have even placed his capital to be exactly due east of the measurement of the equinox from St. Peter's Square. If you create an azimuth on the globe at this direction at sunrise, it leads to Constantinople. So this is part of the reason he placed his new capital in relation to the old one. And we can see him having created the first St. Peter's Basilica there at the Vatican, and also creating the Royal District of Constantinople, where what's interesting about this whole phenomena, too, it's generational. His son and grandson later brought obelisks to Constantinople and placed them in the Hippodrome in a simpler context to the one that was in Rome as well. So over time, his entire family set up this geographic relationship that was reflective of the equinoxes between the two capitals.
Huh.
Yes.
It's so fascinating, and we're going to find that this design structure stretches to so many different areas. But you did say something interesting that they had, when you're looking at these over long distances, they do adjust for the curvature of the Earth. So they had a good idea of the shape of the Earth. So we know that they didn't always think the Earth was flat like we're taught in school.
Yeah, that's correct. And you see that just being part of the mystery that in the past would have been much harder for the average person to sort through. Of course, now we have things like Google Earth
Right.
that can help us make these associations a lot easier, because even doing this on a flat map requires some trigonomic and geometric skills that are unique to the scale of each map you're trying to draw the correct arc on. So Google Earth has made it really easy for you to draw an arc on the globe and really see the relationships like this, and that this is indeed a cultural activity that was planned and goes beyond the scope of any possible just random associations.
Yeah. And there are so many people I've talked to who allude to these connections, but I've never seen anyone go into the level of detail that you do. I'm kind of curious how you got down this rabbit hole. I guess I believe your study started with Thomas Jefferson, didn't it?
Yes, Thomas Jefferson. I did. It's interesting in that regard, because I found later that a lot of people who are interested in these types of things were drawn to them through the alchemical representations that are in cathedrals in Europe and structures in the old world. But I started by looking at Thomas Jefferson, and I had seen a few videos about ley lines and read a little bit about it. And from having lived and worked in Virginia for a long time, I was familiar with his architecture and realized that he had built two octagonal structures. And one of them is his small country estate, Poplar Forest, which is a little less known than Monticello, his main estate near Charlottesville. And both the Monticello has an octagonal turret in its design that you can see from plan view, and Poplar Forest at first was completely just an octagon. And really what you see is Thomas Jefferson is kind of venerating or giving a nod to Constantine the Great, because he built 4 octagonal structures, and all of them had these directional qualities. And really, as I dug in, I even found out that there's a lot of 19th century historical accounts that say Constantine the Great had built an octagon on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. This is where the Dome of the Rock is today, which is an octagon. And even the Dome of the Rock is oriented to point to St. Peter's Square and the obelisk there. One of the sides of the octagon does this, and then the obelisk and one of the windrose marker at the Vatican points back to the Dome of the Rock. So one azimuth on the globe is defined by both of these structures. And if you look into it, it's just odd that the Muslims would build a Byzantine imperial form of architecture for their holy place. And as I looked into that, I found that Byzantine Emperor Justinian II had actually sent artists and engineers to assist the Caliph Malik, the Muslim ruler of Jerusalem at that time, in the building of the Dome of the Rock.
Interesting.
Yeah, so there's lots of room for, theories of imperial manipulation, that Justinian II was simply rebuilding the octagon that Constantine had built before. And we have some architectural historians even saying that this is the original structure, that it was never demolished, that we've kind of been scammed into believing that it's something other than it actually is.
Right. Yeah, there are so many cover-ups and mysteries in history that examining some of these things gives you great clues into the real nature of some of them. I know one of them that was interesting to me. I know you're a fan of Graham Hancock. I am as well. And you've been interested in the hunt for the Ark of the Covenant. And you've extrapolated some clues from these patterns that tie into the story of that artifact, right? In relation to the Vatican and some of the things it points to?
Yeah, and that's really interesting, too, because there were already existing theories that people were espousing that somehow the Ark of the Covenant once made its way from Ethiopia to Chartres Cathedral in France. And one of the places in Ethiopia where it had previously supposedly been was Lalibela, Ethiopia. And this is the home to the churches that are built right into the bedrock there. And most of them are in the shape of the Greek cross from plan view. And those infer an octagon as well, an 8-sided figure. And what we see is using the obelisk and inroads at St. Peter's, it points directly to Lalibela, Ethiopia. And this is a place that some of the theories state that the Emperor Mescal Lalibela built this as a reproduction of Jerusalem. And even today, there is a pilgrimage associated with Lalibela and the Ethiopian Orthodox Church there. And we know, from Graham Hancock's work that he believes the Ark of the Covenant is there in the Church of St. Mary in Axum, Ethiopia. And that this same line that goes to Lalibela goes close to there. It doesn't cross both places at once, but it's very close as well. But what we see with the the lore of the Ark of the Covenant, if you go back to the Vatican, the axis mundi there that points to Lalibela, and you plot a line in the exact opposite direction, crossing over the opposite windrose marker, it now goes to Chartres Cathedral. So you have one continuous association, a line, an azimuth on the globe that is suggested by this relationship that goes from Chartres to Lalibela while transecting the Egyptian obelisk at the Vatican. So, and it all involves the lore of the Ark of the Covenant. So it seems like that this could have been arranged, that somehow Lalibela had constructed his city and the churches there in this context, and then later Chartres Cathedral as well.
It's just what I find so interesting about this stuff, that you're sometimes able to see those correlations between structures.
Well, it begs the question, was it all arranged? I mean, obviously it was. And then the corresponding mythology of all three places developed kind of possibly around just this geographic relationship itself.
Yeah, that could be.
Yeah.
It could not be the true trajectory of the ark at all.
Exactly. It could be just a mythology that's been applied there, possibly. Or it could be true, too. We know there's, kernels of truth in myths and legends and things like that. And I mean, that's part of what I've tried to do in my work, is kind of remain a little more objective and not go too far down the New Age rabbit hole without looking at practical reasons that these things are done. And really what I come up with many times is stranger than what the myth is in reality, So.
Right. And that's always a fun conclusion to find. But you do often use the term geomancy when talking about these things. Do you think, at least in some cases, there is an energetic property or magical property to these arrangements?
I think that there's at least a strong belief in through time. I mean, we see that, like, for instance, a lot of these relationships wouldn't be possible without the collection of ephemeris, or what is known as star charts, like star logs of sightings that, at a place like the Vatican or the Tower of the Winds or the Great Pyramid, that these things had been collected for hundreds of years.
Mm-hmm.
So they were well aware of the cycles of the movement of the sun and the moon and the stars given a fixed point. And this confuses a lot of people, too, because they don't believe this is possible, because most of the history of navigation centers around nautical navigation, which is more difficult. So, I mean, you even see people claiming property for their sovereigns in relation to places, for instance, that the Dome of the Rock points to. And that's part of what this is all wrapped up in later, royal entities using it as a way to legally define their domain to each other in terms they could understand. So they're saying, I own this. It's a certain angle and a certain amount of miles away from the Vatican, for instance, and this is mine.
Gotcha.
And they would do a certain, claiming ritual and ceremony associated with that. I mean, that we even saw Constantine the Great doing when he established Constantinople. He scraped out the boundaries of the royal district using the spear of destiny. In a ritualistic manner. So All of the augurs were there, and we're doing all of the appropriate. It's somewhat analogous to the laying of the cornerstone ceremony that Masons do, but on a much larger scale.
Yeah. Yeah. And you kind of alluded to this earlier and gave us an example, but have you ever been able to find any other strange political associations based on the geometry, or maybe gain insight into the influence of certain groups or secret societies in places where we wouldn't have thought that they should be involved?
Well, that's kind of what happened when I started to look into Thomas Jefferson. I mean, there's no official records that he was a Mason, but all the Masons say he was, that his records were destroyed or lost. And I found that when he built Poplar Forest, for instance, it may have had an association with a close companion, not companion of his, but correspondent, Alexander von Humboldt. And they were both members of the Linnaean Society of London. And Alexander von Humboldt was the Prussian royal court geographer. And we see at this time the Prussians kind of supported us in the revolution indirectly, and they also supported the Scottish Jacobites, who I believe are in large part responsible for the creation of the United States in a kind of secret way.
Mm-hmm.
We had, exiled Scottish people who had lost revolutions in England that had been sent to the colonies in two different periods, and they affected the revolution here in a large way. So you can see that Thomas Jefferson seems to have oriented his octagon of Poplar Forest. First, it points to just within a few hundred yards of Monticello, his other home.
Mm-hmm.
And then it proceeds to point within another few hundred yards of James Madison's estate, Montpelier. And Madison's estate is oriented to point a line right back to Poplar Forest. And recently they have uncovered an octagonal structure at Montpelier. This just happened within the last few months.
Wow.
That archaeologists, yes, have actually, whether it was a gazebo or a separate structure, I'm not clear on yet. I didn't see that in what I read, but he did have an octagonal structure there. So interestingly, this line continues, and it really, in the rest of North America, it doesn't really transect or cross anywhere of significance, but it crosses the North Atlantic to Scotland, to Stirling Castle, and it points at a giant octagonal earthworks known as the King's Knot at Stirling Castle. So really what Jefferson is showing you here is his allegiances to Scotland and possibly the Jacobite cause as well. And this would have been also backed up by his time in France that he spent with the secret societies there, because even a lot of Scottish nobles are also French nobles, and they allied themselves with France against England through history many times. And we see that in the American Revolution, our allies were France and these Scottish exiles and others as well who sympathized with the Jacobite cause. So there's a little secret there. And that's interesting too, because the King's Knot, the octagon there, points to the Dome of the Rock.
It all goes back to the dome.
Right.
But to clarify how this works, or to give people a visual of how these alignments are measured, I guess the best thing to do is imagine you have a site or a building, and if you're looking down with a bird's eye view, whatever shape it is, square, octagon, or otherwise, a building or a property line or a garden is made of line segments. And what you're talking about is extending these line segments, these sides of one building, sometimes around the globe, until you find yourself lining up with a side of a totally different site somewhere, right?
Right. You measure it as closely as you can, which I've learned to do really accurately using a high-end GPS unit I have here. I've compared it to places on Google Earth that I can measure here near where I live and found it to be very accurate. And you measure the side of the building, and then you can just pull that measurement across the globe and see what it intersects with. And really, it was, many times I would sit at the computer, about looking at this on Google Earth. And like, for instance, when I pulled the measurement from the Vatican to the Dome of the Rock, and it matched the angle of the facet of the building, and then crossed the windrose marker, you just sit there stunned that this had been done, and you see it all through history. I mean, after a while, this kind of became a fad with landed gentry in Europe and England, and they would build follies on their estates that reflected these values. Many times they would build reproductions of the Tower of the Winds, even in Athens, which is an octagon. And the one in Athens is interesting because one of the facets points to Avebury Circle in England. And then a lot of the other facets point to places that are important in Greek classic mythology and culture, like Ephesus, the Battle of Troy, the Battle of Marathon, Artemis, Greece. It points directly to these places. And there's even structures in the Agora there in Athens surrounding that were aligned with regard to the way that the power of the winds points.
That's so interesting. And another modern connection I wanted to talk about in relation to Jefferson's Poplar Forest is one side, if you extend it, it points to the Georgia Guidestones, which are a monument we've been talking about a lot on the show lately. I'm sure you've heard about the notch that was cut, the small stone that was added with codes and then chiseled into it, and then they took it out and broke it up. So a lot of people are trying to decode the message in this ritual of sorts, and who knows what it means, but you found that it does have some interesting connections in terms of alignment, one being that poplar forest.
Right. Well, I've kind of changed that a little bit. The alignment I have for poplar forest, I and other people looked at it. Many times I'll get other people to double check my work as well. And it goes about 11 miles from the Georgia Guidestone, so it doesn't point exactly there. But if you look at the millennial themes that are included on the Georgia Guidestones, a lot of people point to the Age of Reason theme that it has being associated with Thomas Jefferson and his ideals. So I think that message, I take it more as a suggestion and not something that's going to happen like a lot of people have tried to turn it into.
Right.
And that's possible. I wouldn't discount that at all. I'm not here to finally judge or tell you what's going on for sure. But I've come to view the Georgia Guidestones as a hexagonal array. Based on, if you look at the plan view of the monument, it suggests more of a hexagon than an octagon. And it does point to some interesting places using that template, including Charleston, South Carolina, where the Scottish Rite was created of masonry. And one of the other azimuths also points to Constantinople, right to the Egyptian obelisk there, going back to a veneration of Constantine again. And really, in a Masonic point of view, I would say, or context, that they value what Constantine did. And if you look at the history of Masonry coming to Europe, we have Charlemagne's grandfather bringing operative stonemasons from the Byzantine Empire to Europe for the first time. And we later see his grandson, Charlemagne, building his octagon at Aachen Cathedral. And all architectural historians will tell you that the interior of this octagon is styled just like the Dome of the Rock. So here we have even Charlemagne having discerned this mystery and knowing somehow. Many people say, oh, he's venerating Muslim forms of art. He's not. This is when you see an octagon, they're talking about Constantine the Great and the Tower of the Winds in Athens, and not anything else, in my opinion. So he was hip to all of that, and he admired Constantine and the Byzantines very much. He brought spolia, or pieces of architecture, from Constantinople and Ravenna, Italy, and had them used in the building of the cathedral. He brought statues of Justinian I and II, and really he might have even seen himself as being related to Constantine the Great in this manner. And we also have the obelisk and windrose markers at the Vatican pointing directly to Aachen Cathedral. And Charlemagne, of course, is the first Holy Roman Emperor.
Man, the coincidences just keep stacking up.
Yeah, well, it's to the point where it can't be.
Right, exactly. How many coincidences do you really need to extrapolate a real pattern? But another point on the guide stones, and I'm kind of with you, is it seems like they are exactly what they say, guide stones for if there was some cataclysm, people could find it. It's written in all the different languages that Earth is known and could extrapolate some type of guide for maintaining life on the planet. And you could say that the first one is a little scary, maintaining the population under 500 million people, but the rest of them I completely am in agreement with. So, yeah, they might be planning some type of big, scary thing. A lot of people today are attributing it to Ebola. But one interesting point I've heard you say, just to fuel that side of the conspiracy fire, is there is an alignment with where they store those FEMA coffins and the Georgia Guidestones, isn't there?
Well, that's more along the line that's coming from Poplar Forest that Thomas Jefferson created. And that's also, the name of the town is Madison. That's a president.
Yeah.
And then a little further on the line crosses Monticello, Georgia, and so on. So these people would even create small towns that were in the know about this, possibly, and name them after presidents or having something to do with Thomas Jefferson. So that the FEMA coffin thing was a little scary that they ended up, and on top of that, are there in a town named for a president. And really what you're seeing with the Georgia Guidestones and some of this that Thomas Jefferson is doing, and I know Jay Widener has spoken about this as well before, that these are millennial monuments.
Mm-hmm.
And really that this is a tradition that goes way back into the Dark Ages and before, of a fear of the end of the world from the Book of Revelations and other sources. And I think over time, some people have come to view this concept as a way of controlling people through fear. So that's possible too. But on the other hand, what all of these monuments have in common, and we have the Georgia Guidestones, the Great Cyclic Cross of Vendée, and even Coral Castle down there in Florida, the star chart at Hoover Dam that was created by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, all of these places give you a way to fix the North Star.
Mm-hmm.
And the equinoxes and the time of day. So you have all of these elements at the Georgia Guidestone, the millennial warning and the commandments themselves, obviously. And then the monument is telling you here, if the worst ever happens and everything hits the fan, we're giving you a way to determine true north, the time of day, and the time of year accurately. So that's kind of what's going on. You see at Coral Castle, we have the same thing going on.
Right. And I did want to ask you about Coral Castle because so many people write me and ask me to cover Coral Castle more, but the story hasn't really changed and it's a little light to do 2 hours on, but I have heard you talk about some of the new details you found by looking for these geographical connections and the fact that this might be one of these millennial monuments. Can you tell the people the story of Ed and Coral Castle for the folks who might not be too familiar with it and your take on this mystery?
Sure. Yeah, briefly, Ed Leedskalnin came from Riga, Latvia, and supposedly the reason he left Latvia is because he was jilted at the altar by a 16-year-old bride. So he briefly traveled around America, including a brief stay in Washington State, and he ended up down there in Florida. Now, I believe in the end that we can see that this was all by design, in my opinion. Because what he did when he went down there was end up building Coral Castle all by himself. I mean, this is an amazing accomplishment. Ed was a trained stonemason, so that explains why he, was able to even contemplate taking on such a task. And the story was he was building it for his, Sweet 16 to come join him in Florida. So what I found as I began to examine it is, Coral Castle did conform to all the elements present in a millennial monument. And it gives you a way to calculate the equinox and cite the North Star. And Ed also included a sundial as part of the construction. And then also in a lot of these millennial monuments, you see the images of the sun, the moon, and the stars, because these are the objects that are actually used to navigate and calculate these positions on the globe.
Mm-hmm.
So as I began to examine, I looked at, again, I went back to the Vatican and the windrose markers, and lo and behold, one of them pointed directly to Coral Castle.
Huh.
So then the possibility was brought that this was why he had placed it where he did. And then on top of that, as I looked at it more, I spoke of how the axis at the Vatican points to the Dome of the Rock. The azimuth that points to Coral Castle is the exact opposite one. So here again, we have the Dome of the Rock pointing to the Vatican and continuing on to point to Coral Castle. So Ed-situated Coral Castle, where both the Dome of the Rock and the array at the Vatican point this way. And then, even more amazingly, is this single azimuth now associating 3 millennial monuments on the planet continues. It comes to Cozumel Island in Mexico, which is the first place that Spain ever claimed Mexico and did their claiming ceremony.
Right.
And I mean, I found other instances of this. The Dome of the Rock points to the Solomon Islands in the South Pacific, and we know King Solomon lived on the Temple Mount and built the temple there using the angels and demons. So that's the reason those are named that as well. Other places, the Philippines, many places the Spanish and Portuguese pilots claimed property were places they landed, looked at the moon, sun, and stars, and figured their spatial relationship with the Dome of the Rock or the Vatican. So this is what Ed was doing in some sense, I believe. So even him moving it, after a while, he moved Coral Castle.
That's what I thought was most interesting.
And it actually ended up being closer in a better alignment after he had moved it.
Right. And for people who haven't seen Coral Castle, you got to check it out. Apparently it was, built by this one guy. He says he built it using the secrets that were used to build the pyramids, and he moved these giant multi-ton pieces of coral in these really precise alignments, and some of them you're like, how could that even be moved? I hear that the doors to it are on a particular type of hinge that people can't figure out how they would have taken the stone that big and got it so perfect on there. And the fact that he built all of this, not once, but then he dismantled it and took it to some other location. I mean, that to me speaks of the fact that it is very important where it lies on the earth in relation to maybe either if it's not ley lines of energy, then it must be just wanting to be in coordinates with these other millennial monuments. But man, to build it twice is just, it adds another layer of awe to the whole thing.
Right. And I forgot to mention as well that one of the other windrose markers at the Vatican points to his hometown of Riga, Latvia as well.
Ah.
So he was even from a place that was being pointed to. And since he was an operative stonemason, he may have been part of a Masonic group of some one type or another that was aware of this.
And you did mention the big story is that Ed built this because of his jilted lover, and he would often refer to her as his Sweet 16 lover. And you believe that was a bit of a coded message more about these monuments possibly, right?
Well, I think, in my opinion, you see the 16 windrose markers at the Vatican, and you have one of them pointing that way. He's kind of giving you a veiled reference to these octagonal arrays that every 22.5 degrees could possibly point to something. And maybe the Sweet 16 reference was in reference to the windrose markers instead of his girlfriend.
I think you're onto something there, man, because he's very into his coded messages. He didn't want to reveal the secrets, but he left a book that alludes to how he did it several times. And I think you're right. He was a guy who definitely liked his mysteries, and he got a kick out of hinting at them. And I think that Sweet 16 thing definitely could be part of it.
Right. And he was obviously very intelligent man.
Mm-hmm.
And he was living during the era of Nikola Tesla.
Right.
So he may have been looking at some of those kind of ideas and was smart enough to try to give an attempt to do this, at least if he didn't actually do it. And I don't want to burst everybody's balloon out there by saying he couldn't do any of the more supernatural things that are said or anything. I can't prove one way or another. All I can say is I noticed that the structure and the placement of the building fit the model that I had developed for all these other millennial monuments as well.
Yeah, those are interesting connections for sure. They cannot be ignored. And this alignment is probably the only real new insight into the whole situation since I'd first heard the story. And the mystery of how it was done still remains, but apparently he wouldn't let anybody see how it was done. And one of those paranormal claims you alluded to comes from the story that some kids were sneaking around at night and they saw Ed standing there and the stones were just floating into place. And then there's the anecdote from when he was moving the site to that other spot 10 miles down the road in Florida. He hired a truck driver to transport the stones, but he would tell the guy to leave or to go grab some lunch, and the guy would come back, and Ed had the stones loaded in the truck. Some suggest using that same type of energy to float them into place. And those are the stories that bring me back to the idea of some energetic vortex on some of these locations, and it's tough to know. But when people do try to say it's like a naturally occurring thing along these ley lines or something, I wonder if that's the case, why we don't just catch boulders floating on their own near these sites every so often.
Right, and I don't discount any of that right out of hand. I mean, I would eat crow if I was wrong, but I think that that's entirely possible. Something like that could be known of or used. We do, like we were talking about Tesla. He proved that electricity can travel through the earth, in an ordered way, and things like that, or through the air as well. So who knows what it would take to actually harness this, and it might not have been as difficult as we see in the past. I mean, back in ancient Egypt, they had kinetic art that used magnets, water pressure, and all kinds of more modern concepts that we don't even think of, being applied there like that. Mm-hmm. So anything is possible, and there could be an ancient knowledge of that. But also, people should also stop to think of a minute about the value of people getting you to believe things like that.
Fair.
Are absolutely true. That this is how a millennial monument could work as far from a manipulative standpoint. Mm-hmm. Giving you some sort of more far out explanation for a real thing, that may or may not have a root of truth in it. So it can be used to manipulate and fool you as well.
That's true. I definitely believe that. It's very hard to know what the truth is because you got people on multiple sides trying to get you to believe multiple things for a whole host of reasons. It gets pretty tricky, but this is pretty concrete. Your work, it's very hard to lie about the actual geographical placements of some of these monuments. It's right there. So in those cases, you can't be manipulated.
Right, and what you'll see, too, that's interesting is many of these places do have an overlay of mystique seemingly intentionally placed. I mean, from the Rennes-le-Chateau mystery, which has elements of this, where there's a star in the landscape, all of the legends there. You see in Colonial Williamsburg, where the octagonal powder magazine is, there's the legend of Bacon's Vault. We have the location of Oak Island being pointed to by several ancient axes. Yes, and then with Thomas Jefferson's Poplar Forest, you have the Beale treasure legend.
I'm not familiar with that one.
Yeah, there's a treasure right there in the area where Poplar Forest is located that's supposed to be hidden somewhere in the area. And the man who, developed the treasure legend or left the records of it even possibly being there, his name was Thomas Jefferson Beale. So I think Thomas Jefferson created this myth, myself, personally, to draw you to Poplar Forest so you will figure out what that is. So these men intentionally leave mysteries behind. I mean, we see Constantine the Great likely left a mystery to actually where his remains were. Nobody actually really knows. And so my theory is that they're on the Temple Mount where he built his octagon. Then we see Charlemagne later figuring all of this out, and he left a mystery as to where his remains were. That was actually solved by one of his grandsons that was the Holy Roman Emperor, Emperor Otto, found his body, and this is a myth. It's not recorded as being actually true, but that's where he found the illuminated manuscript, the Coronation Gospels, which are very famous and well known, and are the Gospels that are used to coronate German kings. So these were found. So he left a mystery, and so this is partially what's going on with Thomas Jefferson. He's left us a mystery using his architecture. And as I said, I found it led me to the King's Knot. The Octagon of Monticello points to Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland, which is another famous place of mystery that has many millennial themes involved. So that's one reason I enjoy Jay Widener so much. He did so much good work about the Great Cross of Vendée. And I applied my model of what was going on. And at first, I didn't even think it would have to do with my work because it wasn't a geometric structure. It was a simple, small monument. But as I read The Mystery of the Cathedrals, the book, there's several references in the book to value true north, and that where it's just told to you and not even veiled terms that this is what you're supposed to do, and that the sun and the moon and the stars on the monument are telling you to create an octagonal template using true north. And when I plotted all of this out, I did find some stunning associations, including one of the azimuths from the Great Cross of Vendée pointing directly to Jefferson's poplar forest.
Interesting.
And he would have likely been aware of this via his association with Alexander von Humboldt and other people like him.
And on the subject, you mentioned Jay Widener. We just recently had him on the show, and we talked a little bit about the lore of Mount Shasta. And you were telling me before we got started here that you've spent a lot of time up there and came up with some theories of your own about that area. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, yeah, this is one of those places, Mount Shasta, where you can kind of see an intentional application of mythology. I mean, the very first reference to creatures living beneath the mountain, or it being associated with Lemuria, is channeled information. It's information that, if you dig back through where all of this came from, this is a man who lived in Wairika near Mount Shasta, and he was receiving communications from another entity. So it depends on how much you believe things like that or not.
I've definitely never experienced anything like that in my life, but I've talked to enough researchers that I'm pretty on board with the idea that at the top of most secret societies, they're trying, if not actually, they're trying to communicate with something non-human. But again, without any personal validation, it's all just guesswork.
Right. And you can also see where a concept like that could be used to possibly hide some other truth. It could be part of the reason that all of this is applied. And when you dig down into the historical truth of what's going on, often it may explain why they would create this diversion, so to speak.
Do you think there's have you had any indications of what that motivation might be at Mount Shasta, what they might actually be trying to cover up with all this fantasy? Yes.
And really it started to unravel in that respect for me when I examined a certain gentleman named Joaquin Miller. And he's a writer and poet, and he was known as the Poet of the Sierras. And he was an interesting kind of almost like a American country Saint Germain figure or traveling mystic type of fellow.
Mm-hmm.
And he lived in the Mount Shasta area and wrote a book, his life amongst the Modocs, the Modoc Indians there, which was really way more popular in England than it ever was in the United States. But while he was there, he lived right near Castle Crags, just south of the mountain. And there's some strange petroglyphs there that seem to have a Masonic motif or a New Age theosophic motif to them. And so later, Joaquin Miller would travel the courts of Europe and associate with the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, which is kind of an occult-oriented artist guild in England and France that he had a large association with. He traveled all the major cities of Europe. And then when he returned to the United States, he lived in Washington, D.C. for 2 years, exactly where Meridian Hill Park in Washington, D.C. is now. And this is the so-called sacred longitude or White House meridian that was actually marked by Thomas Jefferson himself, who laid surveying pier stones along this meridian. And this meridian also includes earlier in history Captain John Smith, famous from Jamestown, traveling to Accokeek, Maryland, which is also on the sacred longitude, and, quote, teaching the Native Americans the Holy Grail. So that's a weird reference to somebody teaching somebody the Holy Grail.
Right.
In myth. And so there's another myth being applied early. So Joaquin Miller came and intentionally lived in a log cabin on this alignment. So he was aware of this. And then it really becomes obvious when he moves back to Oakland, California, and he seeks out and purchases property that's exactly 180 degrees due south of Mount Shasta. And he proceeds to build a pyramid there. And 2 other towers as well. So he's using the mountain itself as an axis. So as I still studied on, I found that there's an odd tower in Palo Alto, California, called the Frenchman's Tower. And as I began to research that, I found a lot of evidence that said exiled French King Henry V was behind the construction of this tower, which is also due south of Mount Shasta. It aligns with Miller's monuments and the mountain as well. So we see all this kind of corresponds to a huge royal European interest in the gold rush as well.
Man, that is so interesting. Of course, the elites would have their hand in a gold rush anywhere on the planet, but it's cool to be able to sort of track that through the study. And to keep it weird, it is a bit odd that so often these structures they're interested in placing are obelisks or pyramids, like you mentioned, and they all kind of have the same sort of similar shape of coming to a point at the top, pointing upwards towards the sky like a spire. And maybe this is just tradition or superstition among these people. Of course, we have the Osiris myth, which puts importance on the obelisk, but maybe instead of a natural energetic phenomenon, maybe there's some type of power from that structure that draws up energy from the earth or something like that that's just kind of been kept hidden from the mainstream.
That's possible. I just, as I observe historical records and the history of everything, of course, there's nobody coming out right and saying that except later researchers who are just supposing that it's possible. I think it is possible, but really what started to bring it all home with regard to Mount Shasta for me is throughout the 18th century and 19th century, I saw a large propensity for Scottish nobles and Norman Scots nobles from France building these structures.
Mm-hmm.
And so as I studied, even the later bloodline or family members came to control the Hudson's Bay Company of Canada. And we know that they ranged into what is now the Western United States quite a lot. And I found out that they even had a huge influence in the early history of Mount Shasta. If you look at the earliest town in the Mount Shasta area, it's one of them is called Dunsmuir. And in Scottish Gaelic, that means Fortress of Muir. And then we also have McLeod, California, which is right at the base of the mountain, named for one of the Hudson's Bay explorers. So all of these descendants of James Douglas, in other places in America, they're responsible for building the International Peace Garden, which has a huge octagonal fountain or sunken gardens there that is used as a sighting device. We have Thomas Jefferson's poplar forest pointing to Mount Shasta and other things of this nature that kind of make it a special place. So to me, given the terms that I see, that they valued it for its position on the earth, the fact that it's a beautiful place. So possibly a lot of this mythology and lore was later applied intentionally, because really what all this infers is that they do have something hidden there.
Mm-hmm.
There's something there of value, It used to be a very remote place. Maybe at one point something was hidden there using these systems that I see. I've corresponded with a lot of treasure hunters who are interested in my work because they have seen parallels in some of the things they've looked for and actually found using systems like this.
Yeah, I find that so fascinating, and that was a question I had for you. We already talked about a few instances of treasure, but I thought that these could possibly be markers or clues to where some of these treasures could be hidden. And I love the idea that in modern times, there's still huge troves out there just waiting to be discovered. You said you coordinated with some treasure hunters. That's got to be pretty crazy. Has it ever resulted in a find? I'm sure we would have heard about it if it had.
No, it hasn't. But they're looking, and really that part of what I think is possibly a lot of even the treasures are just myths intended to draw the curious. And really what happens is you're kind of drawn into a mystery school where you're forced to learn, the beliefs of the people who built the structure, what the tradition of it, and everything else involved. And going back to Jay Widener, nowhere else but in the Great Cross of Vendée all of these alchemical references, and in the book Mystery of the Cathedrals, where it's discussed, there's lots of veiled and hidden things in there that you might only understand if you have enough background knowledge to have the eyes to see, so to speak. So there are lots of things hidden in places like the Great Cross of Vendée. I mean, I found that when I plotted the Great Cross to point to places, it led to this small town in Spain called Ronda, Spain, the southern orientation. And lo and behold, I started to search through Ronda, and there's a place there called Palacio Salvatierra that has an inscription that includes many of the same characters that are on the Great Cross of Vendée. Huh. In front of the Palacio is another cross that is almost exactly like the Great Cross of Vendée. And then 2 doors away from this Palacio Salvatierra is Palacio Moctezuma, because the Montezumas, some of them were made Spanish nobility after the time of Cortez. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of the imagery, of course, that Jay Widener saw pointed him to the way to Peru. So the columns holding up the porch at Palacio Salvatierra are Incans. They're called Incan figures. They're Atlantes. They're human figures that are columns that are holding up the porch there. So there's scant clues with the same kind of characters or fonts that are on the Great Cross and other things that led me here to believe it was associated. And then I began to even just dig into the European Spanish intervention with the Aztecs. And we see that Cortez showed up, that Montezuma predicted the day that Cortez would arrive. And to me, that's a ding, 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 ding setup. And a lot of people forget this too. I mean, back in this era that these, colonial powers had vast intelligence services. I mean, even with native peoples, they might find ways to manipulate them ahead of time and kind of soften them up. I mean, it's in the modern world, it's called spooking the natives. That's what's referred to in spycraft as creating something like that. So later we see back to Alexander von Humboldt. He was the first European scholar to come examine the Aztec sunstone, which is based on the Mayan calendar. So we see a direct link right here to the whole millennial craze of 2012. That's what we just saw.
Right.
Those were millennial concepts being used to instill awareness and or fear in the public at large.
We're the natives now.
Right, exactly. And I think some of the things that the Europeans saw when they came and examined the beliefs and the technical skill the natives had in measuring the stars, that it kind of freaked them out. And there was a blowback that even had a huge impact on the psyche of the Europeans, given what the Native Americans were already aware of. They shared the same millennial views as many Gnostic and occult groups in Europe already valued, as displayed in the cathedrals and discussed in Mystery of the Cathedrals long before they even went to the Americas.
Right.
So his examination of the Sunstone, too, he even uses the same kind of terms where he compares it to Eastern Indian religion, and other things that seem, wow, you're reading Alexander von Humboldt, who wrote this in 1803, and he sounds like a modern New Age commentator. But what's interesting about this really is 2 months after he examined the Sunstone, he visited Thomas Jefferson in Washington, D.C. And later in the 19th century, we see a rendering of the Aztec Sunstone, including on the United States Capitol Rotunda. There's a fresco in there that includes the Sunstone.
Wow, man. Really makes you think maybe they were planning that whole 2012 End of Days Great Awakening myth for a long time. And we're kind of casting doubt on a lot of interesting lore, but the idea that it could be manipulated by these groups is also really fascinating. I guess before we wrap this up, man, I know you do have a documentary movie coming out. I saw the trailer for it. It looks interesting. It's called The Secrets of Northern California. Can you tell us a little bit about what that's going to contain?
Sure. It's going to go into more detail about a lot of the things I mentioned about Chico, California. We have interesting early gold rush involvement of European royalty, including one of the early pioneers of California, Peter Lassen. If you examine a map of the Mexican land grant holdings, like prior to the gold rush, we see 3 of our family members holding some of the land grants that they got from Mexico before we became part of the United States. So there's lots of evidence that suggests they knew that gold was here significantly before the, quote, gold rush began. And and it's interesting too, because I found 2 strange stones, and one of them is covered with the moon, sun, and stars that was found in the Feather River Canyon and has a date of 1836 on it, which is significantly before 1848 when the gold rush was supposed to have happened. And this is among one of the richest gold strikes ever. The stone was found. And then I have another interesting stone that has Ogham writing on it that was traditionally used to make land claims as well. So there's a couple of strange stones there in the Feather River Canyon. I'll be talking about those, and I'll be talking about the mysteries of Mount Shasta and my views, kind of what I've discussed here, but more in depth on why Mount Shasta is a valued place.
Sounds awesome, man. I'm looking forward to checking that out when it does come out. And because so much of this material is aided by visuals, you want to tell people where they can dig even deeper on your YouTube channel and your blog, and also they can get your book there too, I believe, right?
Sure. I have about 80 videos on my YouTube channel, Cort Lindahl. Some of the older ones do have a few inaccuracies in there.
It's a process.
Yeah, it is. It's kind of like, it's hard to say right away. I've learned to kind of find things and then wait and go over them more before I write about them or make a video now. So my later videos are a lot more accurate and more fact-checked. And my last book was called Axis Mundi, and there's a link to that on createspace.com on my blog, which is survivalcell.blogspot.com, and a bunch of the book is available for free there. And I'm just getting ready to finish up my next book, and I'm not sure what I'm going to name it, but I think about maybe naming it The Navigators of the Octagon or something in that vein.
That's one of those titles. That's a good title. That'll get people.
Right.
Well, very cool. I've been thoroughly impressed. I've learned a lot. I'm sure the people have as well. Keep doing what you do, man. Thanks for coming on the show, and take care of yourself out there. You don't want to reveal too many secrets.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Greg, for having me, and I've enjoyed being here and being interviewed by somebody who knows all the right questions to ask. So thank you.
Well, I appreciate that, man. I'm not the smartest guy, but I do so much preparation for these shows that I hope it's not too noticeable. But it's been an awesome show, man. Take care of yourself.
All right.
Have a good one. Wow, folks, there we have it. Dense stuff, super interesting. I'm still left pondering a lot of the connections and what they could mean. Really fun stuff. And after talking about Coral Castle and Thomas Jefferson, Constantine, Mount Shasta, and the Ark of the Covenant, in the second hour, we got into the International Peace Garden, Burning Man's alignment, the use of labyrinths, more about the energy or the possible psychological effect, the geomancy of 9/11, Cleopatra's Needle and the Twin Towers and where some of the pieces of debris are kept, connections to biblical prophecy being recited by congressmen, the interactions between ancient cultures that are supposed to be impossible, locations important to the major religions and Mormonism too,